Ann Whitmore was the perfect housewife, and Father Daniel Monroe was the beloved town priest until one sinful secret between them unraveled a web of betrayal, obsession, and a murder that would haunt Westbridge forever. In the town of Westbridge, life moved slowly and quietly. The people there trusted one another, and Sundays were sacred. Church bells rang like clockwork every weekend morning, and families dressed in their best would walk together toward St. Matthew's Catholic Church, a tall brick building with a white steeple and stained glass, windows that shimmered when the sun hit just right. And Whitmore was one of those familiar faces seen each Sunday, always arriving a few minutes early, always alone despite being married. She would take her usual seat in the third pew from the front, hands folded neatly in her lap, head bowed in reverence. Anne had lived in Westbridge for nearly 20 years. She married Richard Whitmore just before her 21st birthday, a wedding that had been the talk of the town at the time. Richard, an ambitious accountant with a solid reputation, had bought them a home in the suburbs. They had 2 children within the first 5 years, both of whom attended private school and excelled in sports and academics. On paper, Anne had everything: stability, comfort, and social respect, but over time, that life had started to feel hollow. She spent most of her days cleaning, organizing, and cooking meals that were often eaten in silence. Richard was busy with work, rarely engaging with her unless necessary. The kids were growing up, increasingly absorbed in their own teenage worlds. Anne, now 39, began to feel like a ghost in her own home present, but unnoticed. It wasn't until she began volunteering at church that she started to feel seen again. Father Daniel Monroe was the parish priest, a man with a calm demeanor and a reputation for kindness. He had been with the church for over 10 years and was widely respected by the community. Anne first met him after Mass one morning while delivering a casserole dish for a church luncheon. Their conversation had been brief, polite, but over the next few weeks their interactions grew more frequent. Anne started volunteering for more events, helping organize fundraisers, arranging flowers for the altar, and even assisting with bookkeeping. Father Daniel always expressed gratitude, and his gentle compliments, though simple, meant more to Anne than she wanted to admit. It started innocently. Anne began staying after Sunday services to help clean up. Then she began coming to weekday prayer sessions, often being the only one there. Father Daniel started walking her to her car afterward, and their conversations grew longer. She found herself smiling more around him, laughing softly at his jokes, and wearing perfume on days she knew he'd be near. The lines were crossed slowly, so slowly that Anne didn't fully realize what she was stepping into until it was too late. There was no one moment where it all began, but rather a series of quiet ones, a hand that lingered a second too long, a compliment that felt too personal, a glance that carried more weight than words ever could. Eventually, the confessional booth became more than just a spiritual refuge, and found herself confessing feelings, not just sins. Father Daniel, bound by his vows, never encouraged her, but he didn't stop her either. That silence was all the permission Anne needed to keep going. Soon, their meetings moved beyond the church walls. They started meeting in secluded places: an empty park at dusk, a library corner far from public view, the back hallway of the parish house. Every encounter grew riskier than the last, but that danger only fueled Anne's desire. She wasn't just breaking marital vows. She was defying the expectations placed on her for years. For the first time in a long while, she felt alive. Richard, unaware of the secret unraveling under his roof, continued on with life as usual. He'd grown used to Anna's quiet presence and didn't to question her comings and goings. If she said she was at the church, he believed her. If she came home late, he assumed it was due to her volunteer work. Their marriage, once full of late-night talks and shared dreams, had become a routine they both endured rather than enjoyed. Anne's behavior began to change in small but noticeable ways. She started dressing differently, subtly at first, then more boldly. She changed her hairstyle, began wearing makeup even when she had nowhere to go. She stopped wearing her wedding ring, claiming it irritated her skin. The lies came easier each day, and guilt, though present, was pushed aside in favor of excitement. Inside the church, no one suspected anything. Anne still appeared devoted, still lit candles and knelt in prayer like any faithful member. Father Daniel gave his sermons with the same calm clarity, never revealing the storm brewing beneath his collar. They communicated carefully in public, using coded language and neutral expressions. But, away from the eyes of the town, they indulged in the affair like two people who believed they were invisible. What neither of them realized was that secrets in small towns never stay buried for long. One Sunday, Anne's neighbor, Mrs. Dorsey, spotted her leaving the parish house well after Mass had ended. She mentioned it casually during a church luncheon, not with suspicion, but curiosity. The comment passed through several ears, each retelling adding new details. Soon whispers began to spread. Despite the risk, Anne didn't stop. The affair grew more intense, more reckless. They began meeting at a local motel under fake names. Anne kept a separate phone hidden inside a box of sewing supplies. Every message from Father Daniel was deleted instantly. But even as they took these precautions, they couldn't erase the growing tension that surrounded them. Anne felt it in the glances of other parishioners, in the shifting tone of Father Daniel's voice, in her own increasing paranoia. She began losing sleep, waking up in cold sweats, checking the doors 3 or 4 times before bed. Yet she couldn't walk away. The relationship had become an addiction, one she couldn't control. She told herself it was love, destiny, something bigger than either of them. But deep down, she feared it was something darker, something she had no power to stop. As fall arrived and the leaves began to change, so did everything else. And sensed the walls closing in, though she couldn't say exactly why. She started keeping a bag packed in her closet, just in case. She thought about telling Richard the truth, then convinced herself it wasn't necessary. She still believed she had time. But time was running out, and soon one small discovery would begin to unravel everything she'd worked so hard to hide. The discovery was subtle, almost accidental. Richard had been looking for his car keys, convinced he had left them in the pocket of his winter coat. As he dug through the closet, his hand brushed against Anne's jacket. A folded piece of paper fell to the floor, nearly missed as it slid under a shoe rack. He picked it up absent-mindedly, assuming it was a receipt or grocery list. But when he unfolded it, he found a hotel invoice dated just 3 days earlier, addressed to a generic name that wasn't Anne's, yet the address listed matched the motel across town. The timestamp showed a check-in on a Sunday afternoon, directly overlapping with the hours Anne claimed she was at a church event. Richard stared at the slip for a long time. His mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe Anne was helping a friend. Maybe she booked the room for someone else. But even as those thoughts surfaced, his gut told a different story. Something didn't feel right. He folded the receipt and slipped it into his wallet without a word. That evening he watched Anne closely. She moved through the house as usual, cooking dinner, tidying up, asking the children about school, but something about her seemed distant. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and she avoided Richard's gaze. The next few days, Richard said nothing, but his awareness sharpened. He began to notice things he had ignored for months. Anne's phone was always face down. She never left it unattended. Her trips to the church had become more frequent, even during weekdays. She'd claimed she was helping organize a food drive, but Richard couldn't remember any announcement about it during service. He also remembered how Anne used to wear her wedding ring religiously. Now it sat untouched on the bathroom shelf. On Saturday, Richard told Anne he had an early work meeting. He left the house before sunrise, parked his car at a friend's place, and waited. Just before noon, Anne walked out of the house wearing makeup and a long coat. She didn't drive to the grocery store or the library. Instead, she headed toward the edge of town toward the motel from the receipt. Richard followed at a distance. His hands trembled on the steering wheel as he watched her pull into the parking lot, park near the back, and enter the office. Minutes later, she stepped out with a key in her hand and walked into room 103. He waited. 20 minutes later, another car arrived. Father Daniel stepped out, sunglasses on, jacket zipped up. He moved quickly, looking around once before slipping into the same room. Richard didn't follow. He sat in his car, frozen. Rage boiled up in his chest, but so did disbelief. For a long time, he simply stared at the building, unable to move. Eventually, he drove home in silence. He didn't tell anyone what he saw. That night, he barely spoke to Anne. She returned home around dinner time, smiling faintly, and said she had spent the afternoon sorting donation boxes. Richard nodded and said nothing. The following day he began compiling evidence. Every detail mattered now. He started logging Anne's phone activity, checking her messages whenever she left the room. He downloaded an app that recorded calls. He went through bank statements, traced purchases, and even checked browser histories. Everything pointed to a double life. The motel visits were frequent, at least once a week. There were email exchanges with coded subject lines and short, cryptic texts that left no doubt. Meanwhile, in the church, things remained seemingly unchanged. Father Daniel still led services, still gave homilies with quiet authority, but beneath the calm exterior, he seemed more withdrawn. His sermons lacked their usual warmth, and he avoided eye contact with certain parishioners. Marie Thompson, an observant widow who never missed a Sunday, had taken note of his change in demeanor. She had once caught sight of Anne leaving the vestry long after Mass ended, and though she said nothing at the time, her suspicions were growing. Marie began to watch quietly from the sidelines. She noticed how Anne's attendance patterns didn't match her public commitments. She saw the subtle glances between Anne and Father Daniel, the slight shifts in body language, the way they carefully avoided being too close but not far enough to silence a careful eye. Marie began writing down dates, even taking photos from her car parked across the street. It started as a personal curiosity, but the deeper she looked, the more disturbed she became. Back at home, Richard now had enough evidence to confront Anne, but he didn't. Instead, he printed the motel receipts, the messages, and the photographs he had taken and placed them in a sealed envelope marked with Anne's name. He left it in her dresser drawer and waited. That night she found it. The house fell into an eerie silence. No screaming, no accusations. She simply stayed in the bathroom for nearly an hour. When she came out, her face was pale and her eyes were puffy. She didn't speak. She went straight to bed, and so did Richard. The next morning, Anne's wedding ring was back in the jewelry box. She stopped going to the church. Her phone stayed off most of the day. The children noticed the shift in atmosphere but weren't told why. Richard maintained the appearance of normalcy, driving them to school, cooking dinner, and smiling at neighbors. But something between him and Anne had broken permanently. Across town, Marie decided to send her documentation to the archdiocese. She mailed the envelope anonymously, including a typed letter outlining her observations. A few weeks later, Father Daniel was placed on temporary leave, though no official reason was given. The church tried to keep things quiet, hoping to avoid scandal, but the rumors had already taken root. Anne was no longer seen in public. She stopped attending PTA meetings, withdrew from the church newsletter committee, and left her volunteer positions. Her friends tried reaching out, but most were met with silence or short excuses. Inside her home, she wandered the halls restlessly, haunted by her own choices. She began to dread the sound of her phone ringing, the knock at the door, or even the mail arriving. Though Richard hadn't told a soul, and knew it was only a matter of time before someone else did, she felt the pressure closing in, the world narrowing around her. She was no longer the admired housewife, the dedicated churchgoer. She had become someone she didn't recognize, someone whose choices had led her into a spiral she couldn't escape. The town's silence was louder than any confrontation. It came in the form of neighbors who didn't wave anymore, friends who crossed the street, and long pauses when her name came up. The affair, once thrilling and hidden, had turned into something suffocating and dangerous, and began to sense that the worst hadn't happened, yet that the real consequences of her choices were still waiting in the shadows. And though she didn't know when or how they would come, she understood something now with terrifying clarity. Secrets were never truly safe, not in a town like Westbridge. 3 weeks after Anne's last visit to the church, a plain white envelope arrived at the archdiocese headquarters. It had no return address and was marked confidential in large block letters. Inside were 8 printed photographs and a typed letter. The images showed Anne and Father Daniel in a motel parking lot, entering the same room at different times, sometimes moments apart. One photo captured them exiting together, Anne fixing her hair, Father Daniel looking away from the camera. Though there was no explicit evidence of physical intimacy, the implication was unmistakable. The letter was blunt. It described repeated meetings between the two at the motel, alleged that a long-term affair had taken place, and demanded that the church take immediate disciplinary action or else the photos would be sent to local news outlets. The author did not ask for money or favors, only accountability. The tone suggested deep moral outrage and a personal investment in exposing the truth. The archdiocese responded quickly. Father Daniel was called in for questioning. He denied everything. He admitted he had counseled Anne several times and that they had become close, but he insisted nothing improper had occurred. When shown the photos, he explained them away as coincidences or unfortunate timing. But the church was not convinced. To protect the parish and preserve its reputation, Father Daniel was placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. He was told to stay away from St. Matthew's and avoid contact with any parishioners. The news spread quietly but swiftly. Though no public announcement was made, the absence of Father Daniel from Sunday Mass did not go unnoticed. Whispers began among the congregation, with theories ranging from illness to personal misconduct. Some mentioned Anne's sudden withdrawal, and others began connecting the dots. In small towns, people don't need all the facts to believe a story. All they need is a little silence and a few clues. Anne found out about Father Daniel's suspension when she received a message from a friend still active in the church. The shock hit her hard. She hadn't expected things to escalate so quickly, certainly not to the level of higher church authorities. Panic set in. She began pacing the house, afraid to look at her phone, terrified of someone else knocking on her door with more questions. She didn't know who had sent the letter, but her instincts told her the list of possible people was short. Richard, perhaps. Or someone from church who had been watching. The idea that others had seen them, captured them, made her skin crawl. At home, things with Richard remained cold but civil. They rarely spoke unless it involved the children. He had not asked her to leave, nor had he mentioned the affair since placing the envelope in her drawer. But his silence was not forgiveness, it was a quiet, calculated waiting, and felt it. He was gathering information, staying composed, biding his time. That frightened her more than if he had screamed or demanded answers. His calmness felt like a warning. A few days later, the second envelope appeared, this time at the editorial office of the local newspaper. It was addressed to the managing editor and contained the same photographs along with a revised version of the letter. The new version included more detail about the affair, suggesting it had been going on for over a year. It included the names of both Anne and Father Daniel and claimed that the church was trying to suppress the truth. The editor hesitated. He knew publishing the story could explode into a scandal, but it was newsworthy and well documented. After a quick legal review, the paper decided to run the story online under the title, Whispers in the Church, Local Priest Under Investigation After Alleged Affair with Parishioner. The story stopped short of directly naming Anne, but gave enough context that anyone in town could guess. Her age, her family status, and her known volunteer work made the connection obvious. By the next morning, it was the most read article on the site. People shared it on social media, gossip threads exploded, and anonymous comments poured in by the hundreds. Anne's world collapsed overnight. Her phone rang constantly. Journalists parked on the street. Friends stopped replying. Her employer, a small local library, called to inform her she was being placed on unpaid leave due to public controversy. At the children's school, other parents whispered in the hallways. The kids came home quiet, confused, and upset. Richard kept them distracted, doing his best to shield them from the fallout. Inside the house, Anne spiraled. She stopped eating, lost sleep, and rarely changed out of her bathrobe. She avoided windows, fearing who might be watching. Her family stopped visiting. The walls of the home seemed to shrink with each passing day, suffocating her with guilt and dread. Meanwhile, Father Daniel had disappeared from public view. The church confirmed his leave but offered no details. Some assumed he had been relocated, others guessed he had resigned. No one had seen him in days. The rectory where he once lived was now quiet, the lights off at all hours. Rumors spread that he had left town entirely. In private, the church tried to manage the situation. They launched an internal review, contacted legal counsel, and quietly encouraged Father Daniel to submit a resignation. They wanted to avoid lawsuits, press attention, or public backlash from donors and longtime parishioners. They believed the scandal would pass if handled quietly. But then something unexpected happened. Marie Thompson, the same widow who had been watching Anne and Father Daniel for weeks, was contacted by a journalist. He asked if she knew anything about the story, if she had seen anything unusual. At first, Marie declined to comment. But after a few hours, she called back. She said she had photos of her own, notes, observations. She shared everything she had, dates, times, and places. The journalist published a follow-up article titled, "The Watcher. Churchgoer Offers New Evidence in Ongoing Affair Allegations." The article added fuel to the fire. Now, the public wasn't just suspicious, they were convinced. It painted a picture of a prolonged, deliberate betrayal, not just a mistake or lapse in judgment. Anne's name began circulating openly on social media, her face now tied to shame and disgrace. Her children were mocked at school. A rock was thrown through the front window late one night. Richard reported it to police, but no one was arrested, and knew things couldn't go back to normal. The affair wasn't a private sin anymore, it had become a public scandal with consequences far beyond what she imagined. And even though she had ended the relationship weeks ago, the effects only seemed to deepen. She considered leaving town, changing her name, starting over, but the house wasn't hers. The children were in school. Richard had quietly contacted a lawyer. A separation was now official. Custody arrangements would follow. She had no job, no support, and no real plan. The affair, once thrilling and passionate, had turned into a cage. And then came the most devastating news of all. Father Daniel had vanished entirely. No one could reach him. His phone was disconnected, his email was inactive. He hadn't withdrawn any money from his bank account in over a week. Church officials were alarmed. Some thought he had fled. Others feared something worse. And sat at the kitchen table staring at a cold cup of coffee when the phone rang. It was the police. They wanted to ask her a few questions about the last time she had seen Father Daniel. She froze. Something had happened. And her darkest days were still ahead. The wooded area behind St. Matthew's Church had long been a forgotten stretch of land. The trees were dense, the path unpaved, and few people ventured there. It was the sort of place that existed quietly at the edge of town life, always present but rarely noticed. But that changed one crisp October morning when a woman walking her Labrador along the forest trail noticed something odd. A shallow pit, barely concealed with branches and loose dirt. Her dog started digging, barking uncontrollably. When she went to pull him back, she saw the outline of a shoe, weathered and half buried. Beneath it was a body. The police arrived within the hour. Crime scene tape went up quickly, and officers pushed back a growing crowd of onlookers. Forensic investigators worked carefully, removing layer after layer of earth. What emerged was a decomposing male body, clothed in dark slacks and a gray wool sweater. No ID, no wallet, no phone. But the dental records confirmed what everyone feared. It was Father Daniel Monroe. The news hit Westbridge like an earthquake. What had once been a simmering scandal erupted into full-blown horror. The priest at the center of a public affair was now dead. And not just dead buried in a hidden grave just yards from the church where he had preached for over a decade. The medical examiner's report only added to the shock. Father Daniel had died from blunt force trauma to the head and chest. His ribs had been broken, and there were signs of a struggle. The cause of death was ruled a homicide. Speculation spread like wildfire. Had he taken his own life and been buried by someone else? Had he been silenced to protect a secret? Some believed it was Anne, others pointed to Richard. A few accused the church itself of covering something up. The case was immediately handed over to the homicide unit. Detectives began interviewing anyone connected to Father Daniel, starting with Anne Whitmore. Anne was brought into the station quietly, through the back entrance. By the time she sat down with investigators, she looked like a shell of herself, thin, pale, and visibly shaken. She admitted she hadn't seen or spoken to Father Daniel in weeks. She said their affair had ended abruptly after the first news article came out, and they had agreed to stay away from each other. When asked where she had been the night Father Daniel likely died, she said she was at home, alone. Detectives pressed her. They showed her crime scene photos, asked about past arguments, and questioned whether Father Daniel had threatened her. She denied everything. No threats, no violence, no plans. When asked if she had been in the woods behind the church, she said she hadn't walked that trail in years. They released her later that evening, but made it clear the investigation was ongoing. Richard was questioned next. He remained calm and cooperative, offering details about his recent separation from Anne and the evidence he had collected of her affair. When asked about his relationship with Father Daniel, he admitted to feeling betrayed and angry, but denied ever confronting him. He said he hadn't seen the priest in person since discovering the motel visits. He had no alibi for the night of the murder. He had been home alone with his children asleep upstairs. His answers were steady, emotionless. The detectives noted the lack of reaction but had nothing concrete to hold him on. Next, the investigators turned to Marie Thompson. Her name had appeared in multiple interviews. She had been the one to document the affair. She had spoken to journalists. She had clearly been watching. When questioned, Marie presented herself as concerned and cooperative. She denied knowing anything about the murder. She said she had felt it was her duty to expose the inappropriate relationship, but never wished harm on anyone. When asked why she had stopped attending Mass shortly before Father Daniel's disappearance, she claimed she didn't feel welcome anymore. Despite long hours of questioning and the discovery of multiple motives, no arrests were made. The investigation slowed. There were no witnesses, no surveillance cameras facing the wooded area, and the murder weapon was never found. For weeks, the town was gripped by fear and speculation. Parents kept their children indoors. Church attendance plummeted. Everyone wondered, was a killer still among them? Meanwhile, Anne was unraveling. She couldn't eat, she couldn't sleep. She jumped at every sound. She was convinced someone was following her, watching her from across the street, tapping her phone. Her paranoia grew worse each day. She stopped answering calls. She refused to leave the house, keeping the blinds closed and the doors locked. The once polished housewife had become a prisoner inside her own home. Richard filed for full custody of the children, citing Anne's instability. The court agreed, and Anne was ordered to undergo a psychological evaluation. She spent 2 nights in a facility for observation. When she returned, she was quieter than before, barely speaking, barely moving. Neighbors said they often saw her sitting in the same spot by the window, unmoving for hours. The church held a memorial service for Father Daniel, but it was sparsely attended. The archdiocese issued a brief statement mourning his loss and promising full cooperation with authorities. No priest was assigned to replace him. St. Matthew's stood quiet for the first time in years. Then, months after the murder, a postal worker sorting late mail found a package addressed to the Westbridge Police Department. Inside was a small wallet and a burner phone. The wallet contained Father Daniel's ID, his credit cards, and a torn page from a hymn book with the words, "Forgive me," written across it in shaky handwriting. The phone had been wiped clean, no contacts, no messages, no data. The items were clean, no fingerprints, no DNA. The discovery reignited the investigation but led nowhere. Detectives reviewed the evidence again. They re-interviewed key figures. Still, nothing stuck. The case remained open, but the leads ran dry. Time passed. Public interest faded. People returned to their routines, but the Unnies never truly left. And sold the house and disappeared. Some say she moved in with a distant cousin in another state. Others claim she changed her name and started a new life far away. Richard stayed in Westbridge with the children, who rarely spoke of their mother. The town avoided the subject altogether, as if by refusing to mention it, they could erase the stain it left behind. But behind the silence was a shared knowledge that something terrible had happened close to home, that trust had been broken, and that someone had gotten away with murder. The woods behind the church grew wilder in the following years, overgrown with weeds and vines. No one walked those trails anymore. The trees stood like sentinels, guarding the secrets buried beneath the soil. And the question lingered, unanswered. Who had killed Father Daniel Monroe? No one knew. Or perhaps no one dared to say. 2 years passed, and the town of Westbridge never truly recovered. The murder of Father Daniel Monroe remained unsolved. The church scandal faded into rumor, and Ann Whitmore became nothing more than a ghost story whispered behind closed doors. Her name was never cleared, nor was it officially attached to the crime, but her image lingered in people's minds like a shadow no one could erase. Some said she had confessed to someone privately before disappearing. Others believed she was silenced or paid off. But none of the theories were ever proven. The police case file stayed open, but with no new leads, it gathered dust in the back room of the Westbridge station. Richard Whitmore rebuilt his life with quiet efficiency. He gained full custody of the children and moved them to a house on the opposite side of town. He never spoke about the past, never mentioned Anne, and never answered questions about Father Daniel. He stayed away from the church altogether, enrolling the kids in a different school and focusing solely on his accounting business. In public, he smiled and made polite conversation, but behind his eyes, there was always a distance, as if he was operating from a place far removed from everyone else. One rainy afternoon, the police received an anonymous letter. No return address, no signature. The handwriting was shaky and uneven, the words difficult to read. It was short and cryptic. Check the cemetery. The stone with no name. You missed something. Enclosed was a photograph of a gravestone, moss-covered, with no engraving. The image was recent, and the background clearly showed the Westbridge Cemetery. The next morning, detectives returned to the cemetery. They located the stone from the photo. It sat at the far end of the property, surrounded by weeds and long grass. They had passed it dozens of times over the years, but had never thought much of it. This time, they brought ground-penetrating radar equipment. What they found below the soil wasn't a body, but an old, rusted metal box. Inside the box were several items: a priest's collar, stained and torn, a flash drive, and a handwritten letter. The letter was brittle, yellowing at the edges. It began with the words, "If you are reading this, I'm already gone." It was signed by Father Daniel Monroe. The contents of the flash drive would shake the town once more. The files contained a series of voice recordings. In them, Father Daniel confessed to the affair, describing how it had begun, how it had progressed, and how deeply he regretted it. But the final recording was different. His voice was panicked, hurried. He said he believed someone was following him. He mentioned Richard by name, said he had seen him parked outside the motel several times. He feared for his life and said he didn't think the church would protect him if anything happened. In the last few seconds of the recording, he pleaded for forgiveness, not from the church, but from someone unnamed. The recordings reignited public outrage. News outlets picked up the story again, and Westbridge was once more at the center of national attention. The police questioned Richard, now for the third time. They asked about the recordings, his movements the night Father Daniel disappeared, and why he had never disclosed that he had confronted the priest. Richard denied everything. He claimed the recordings were fake, manipulated, or taken out of context. He maintained his innocence, said he had no reason to kill anyone, and insisted he had been at home the entire night in question. But the public didn't believe him this time. The court of opinion had shifted. The idea of the betrayed husband snapping and seeking revenge felt more believable than ever. Though the evidence wasn't enough for an arrest, Richard's reputation was permanently damaged. Clients left his firm. The children were harassed at school. Eventually, he sold the business and moved out of state. Just like Anne, he faded from the town's memory, not forgotten, but deliberately erased. The cemetery box was ruled a critical piece of evidence, but the confession raised more questions than it answered. If Father Daniel feared Richard, why hadn't he left town earlier? Why hide the recordings instead of turning them over to police or the church? And why choose that grave, that stone, to bury them under? No answers came. Anne was never found. Her name never appeared on any registry, and no digital trail followed her after she vanished. A few people claimed to have seen her in different towns working as a waitress, walking in a park, driving a rental car, but none of the sightings were confirmed. Her disappearance became its own mystery, a blank chapter no one could close. Over time, the church replaced Father Daniel. A new priest arrived, young and full of optimism. The building was renovated, its walls painted, its altar replaced. The congregation slowly grew again, weddings returned, baptisms were held. But the new generation never fully understood the weight the building carried, the way its walls once echoed with secrets and shame. Marie Thompson died of natural causes 2 years later. She left no journal, no letters, and no indication that she had ever known more than she let on. At her funeral, a handful of attendees whispered about the role she played. Whether she had sent the photos, whether she knew who killed Father Daniel, whether she carried guilt with her to the grave. But the truth died with her as quietly as she had lived. Today in Westbridge, the story is told like a myth. Teenagers dare each other to walk the church trail at night. They say you can hear whispers if you stand near the old vestry. They say Father Daniel still walks the woods looking for justice. They say Ann Whitmore's spirit haunts the cemetery, searching for absolution. None of it can be proven, but no one denies the weight of what happened. There are no arrests, no confessions, no closure. Only a story that refuses to die. A story about a housewife who wanted more, a priest who gave in, a husband who lost everything, and a town that learned the price of silence. In the end, the truth stayed buried, just like the man who once preached forgiveness but found none for himself. And in Westbridge, the leaves continue to fall, the church bells still ring, and the past lingers like a shadow no one can escape.